It was a Friday afternoon in April, the kind of day that promised spring was finally settling in for good. The sun had been out earlier, warm and bright, melting the last of the winter's stubborn gray. People in the small towns of northern Illinois went about their ordinary business, farmers checked their fields, factory workers punched out for the weekend, and children sat in classrooms counting the minutes until the final bell. No one knew that before the sun set, a monster would tear through their lives and leave nothing but rubble and grief. The date was April 21st, 1967. The Tri-Cities area, Belvidere, Marengo, and Harvard, each a quiet farming community linked by county roads and a shared sense of hardworking independence, lay in the path of a powerful storm system that had been brewing all day across the Great Plains. Meteorologists had issued warnings, but in those days the science of tornado prediction was still in its infancy. Radars were primitive, communication was slow, and many people never heard the alerts until it was far too late. The weather that morning had felt unsettled, gusty winds, a strange heaviness in the air, and clouds that seemed to boil upward into anvil tops. But springtime in the Midwest always brought storms. It was nothing new. By early afternoon, the sky had turned a sickly greenish hue. Farmers in the fields recognized that color as a bad omen. In Belvidere, a town of about 10,000 people, the high school students were sitting through their last classes of the week. The school building was a sturdy brick structure, built in the 1920s with tall windows and a grand auditorium. Inside, the halls echoed with the shuffle of shoes and the low murmur of teachers trying to keep attention focused on history quizzes and algebra problems. Outside, the wind began to pick up. Trees bent sideways. Leaves and dust swirled in miniature cyclones across the playground. At around 3:30 in the afternoon, the first severe thunderstorm warnings crackled over some radio stations. But few people in Belvidere had their radios on during the final hour of school. The storm had already spawned a tornado near the town of Cherry Valley, about 15 miles to the west. That tornado touched down briefly, then lifted, then touched down again, growing in strength as it moved east-northeast. It was a classic wedge tornado, wide and dark, with a base that churned like a boiling pot of black soup. The roar could be heard from miles away, a sound like 1,000 freight trains rolling across the prairie. In Belvidere, the high school was having a track practice outside. The coach looked at the sky and saw a solid wall of black clouds advancing. He ordered the students inside, shouting over the rising wind. Some of the boys thought it was just a thunderstorm, maybe a little hail. They had no idea that death was riding that wind. Inside the school, a few teachers had become uneasy. Principal James R. Swanson walked to the window and saw the sky turning to night. He made a snap decision. He grabbed the intercom microphone and ordered all students to evacuate the second floor and move to the basement hallways. It was a quick, desperate call. In the confusion, many students rushed down the stairs just as the first hail began to pound the roof. Stones the size of golf balls, then baseballs, then even larger. The noise was deafening. The tornado, now a powerful F4 on the Fujita scale, had grown to more than a mile wide. It was not a thin rope or a classic funnel. It was a massive, rotating column of debris and destruction, dark gray and nearly invisible except for the swirling cloud of dust and shattered timber at its base. It crossed the Kishwaukee River, siphoning water into its circulation, and then plowed into the south side of Belvidere. Homes were blown apart in seconds. The frames of houses twisted like paper clips. Cars were lifted and tossed into fields. Trees were ripped from the ground, their roots exposed. The tornado's path was a swath of obliteration, a quarter of a mile to a mile wide, and it was aimed directly at the heart of the town where the high school stood. At the high school, the building shook violently. The windows imploded, sending shards of glass flying through the hallways. Students and teachers dropped to the floor, covering their heads. Some screamed, others prayed. The walls themselves began to move. The roof lifted, groaned, and then tore away in sections. In the auditorium, a group of students who had been rehearsing a play were still on stage when the rear wall of the building gave way. The massive brick facade collapsed inward, throwing debris across the room. The tornado spent less than a minute on the school, but in that short time it killed 12 people, mostly students who had been caught in the hallway or in the auditorium. Dozens more were injured, some critically. The roof of the auditorium fell onto the stage, trapping actors and stagehands under tons of brick and steel. Rescue efforts began immediately, but the chaos was immense. Parents rushed to the school, frantic, running through debris and down power lines. The school building was not destroyed completely. The east wing still stood, but the west end was a pile of rubble. As the tornado continued its deadly march east, it left Belvidere in ruins. The damage was estimated at more than $5 million, a staggering sum in 1967. But the true cost was measured in lives lost and families shattered. The tornado was not finished. It crossed into Wisconsin, then curved back into Illinois, then crossed into Indiana before finally dissipating. Along its entire path, more than 30 people died and hundreds were injured. Back in Belvedere, the emergency response was heroic but overwhelmed. The local hospital, St. Joseph's, was itself damaged by the storm but still took in scores of wounded. Doctors and nurses worked through the night treating cuts, fractures, and internal injuries. Volunteers brought blankets and food. The National Guard was called in to keep order and help with search and rescue. For days, bulldozers cleared debris. The smell of splintered wood and damp plaster filled the air. But this segment of the story is not just about the numbers or the statistics. It is about the moment when a community that had never imagined such violence found itself in the eye of a nightmare. It is about the students who laughed just moments before, the teachers who taught them, the parents who waited for them to come home. And it is about the lesson that the weather can turn in an instant, that on a quiet spring afternoon, the sky can fall. The Tri-Cities tornado of 1967 remains one of the deadliest outbreaks in Illinois history, yet many people outside the region have never heard of it. The story was overshadowed by other disasters that year and the memories have faded with time. But for those who were there, the sound of that wind never truly leaves them. As the sun set on that Friday evening, the survivors gathered in shelters, in churches, and in the homes of strangers. They held each other, they grieved, and they began to rebuild. That night, the rain fell over the torn fields and broken houses. In the dark, rescue workers could still hear the cries of the trapped. The search went on for hours by flashlight and by hand. And somewhere in the distance, the storm rumbled away into Indiana, leaving behind a quiet that was heavier than any silence they had ever known. The rain continued to fall through the night, a steady, soaking drizzle that turned the debris into a slippery mess. Rescue workers moved with flashlights, their beams cutting through the darkness, illuminating twisted metal and shattered wood. Every few minutes, someone shouted for quiet and the searchers would freeze, listening for a voice, a moan, a knock from beneath the wreckage. The process was agonizingly slow. Each piece of debris had to be lifted carefully because the structure beneath could collapse further. Firemen, police officers, and volunteers worked side by side, their hands bleeding from sharp edges, their voices hoarse from calling out names. One of the first to be pulled from the high school ruins was a 16-year-old boy named Tommy. He had been in the auditorium rehearsing for the spring play when the wall caved in. A steel beam had fallen across his legs, pinning him to the stage floor. For nearly 2 hours, he lay in the dark, listening to the rain dripping through the gaping hole in the roof and the cries of others around him. When the rescuers finally reached him, they had to use a hydraulic jack to lift the beam just an inch at a time. Tommy never forgot the sound of that jack, a metallic groan that seemed to echo in the hollow space. He also never forgot the face of the fireman who held his hand and told him he was going to be okay. That fireman was a volunteer from a neighboring town, a farmer named Harold, who had lost his own barn in the storm but had driven straight to the school as soon as he heard the news. A few blocks away on Lincoln Avenue, the Anderson family home had been completely flattened. Mr. Anderson, a factory worker at the local Chrysler plant, had been driving home when the tornado struck. He saw the funnel cloud coming and pulled his car into a ditch, lying flat on the floorboards as the wind ripped the doors off the vehicle. When the noise stopped, he crawled out and ran toward his house. He found nothing but a concrete slab. His wife and 2 young daughters were gone. Neighbors later found them in a field a quarter-mile away, still holding each other. The funeral for the Andersons was held 3 days later and the entire town attended. The caskets were small, side by side, and the priest spoke of a promise that the Lord would wipe away every tear. At St. Joseph's Hospital, the emergency room looked like a war zone. The hospital itself had lost power and generators hummed in the basement, providing just enough electricity for the most critical machines. Doctors performed surgeries by flashlight, using instruments that had been sterilized in boiling water over a camp stove. The hallways were lined with injured people on stretchers, on mattresses, on blankets spread across the floor. Nurses moved among them, checking pulses, applying bandages, offering sips of water. There was no time for tears. One nurse, a young woman named Ruth, had just finished her shift when the storm hit. She stayed for 36 hours straight until she collapsed from exhaustion. When she woke up, she learned that her own apartment had been destroyed, but she had no memory of losing her home because she had been too busy saving others. The morgue, a small room in the basement of the county courthouse, quickly filled to capacity. The coroner, Dr. Edward Morrison, worked with 2 assistants trying to identify the bodies. Many were unrecognizable. They used dental records, jewelry, clothing tags. It was grim, meticulous work. Dr. Morrison had seen death before, but never like this. He took breaks by stepping outside and staring at the sky, which was still dark and brooding. He would light a cigarette, inhale deeply, and remind himself that the living needed him more than the dead. In the days that followed, the story of the Tri-Cities tornado spread across the state. Reporters from Chicago and Milwaukee arrived, their cameras capturing the devastation. The front page of the Belvedere Daily Republican showed a photograph of the high school, its west wing reduced to a pile of bricks. The caption read, "A community mourns." But the newspapers could not capture the smell of wet plaster and gasoline that hung in the air, or the sound of hammers and bulldozers that started at dawn and continued until dusk. The cleanup took months. FEMA did not exist in 1967, and federal disaster relief was slow and bureaucratic. The state of Illinois sent in the National Guard to help with search and recovery, but most of the work fell on the shoulders of the survivors themselves. Neighbors helped neighbors. Farmers brought their tractors to haul away debris. Women set up soup kitchens in church basements. Men worked in rotating shifts, digging through ruins, salvaging what they could. A local lumberyard donated wood for temporary repairs. The Red Cross set up a tent in the town square where people could get blankets, clothing, and a hot meal. One of the most heartbreaking tasks was the search for missing children. In the days after the storm, parents walked from shelter to shelter, from hospital to morgue, hoping to find their sons and daughters alive. Some families were reunited in moments of incredible joy. Others waited for days only to receive the news they dreaded. The school kept a list on a bulletin board outside the principal's office. Names of the confirmed dead, names of the injured, names of the missing. Each day, the list changed. By the end of the week, all but 3 had been accounted for. Those 3 remained missing for months, their bodies never found. They were presumed to have been carried away by the wind and buried in some distant field, never to be discovered. The emotional toll was enormous. Many survivors suffered from what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder, but in 1967 it was simply called nerves. They had trouble sleeping, flinched at loud noises, and could not bear to look at the sky when it turned gray. Children refused to go back to school, even when a temporary building was set up in a converted warehouse. Teachers tried to maintain a sense of normalcy, but it was impossible. The classrooms were quiet. The jokes had stopped. In Marengo, a town about 15 miles northwest of Belvedere, the tornado had not struck directly, but the community was deeply affected because many of its residents worked or studied in Belvedere. The high school in Marengo became a gathering place for families who were waiting for news. The phone lines were down, so volunteers drove back and forth between the towns, carrying messages on slips of paper. A boy named David, a sophomore at Marengo High, remembered sitting in the gymnasium with his mother, watching the door, waiting for his father to walk in. His father had been a janitor at Belvedere High School and had been working in the basement when the storm hit. He survived, but he was trapped for hours. When he finally arrived at the gym, covered in dust and dried blood, David and his mother burst into tears. They held each other for a long time, not speaking. Harvard, another of the Tri-Cities, also felt the storm's impact. A separate tornado, weaker but still destructive, had touched down near the town, damaging several farms and injuring a handful of people. But the real connection between the 3 communities was the shared grief. They had all lost something. And they all knew that it could have been worse. The tornado could have killed hundreds. The fact that the death toll was not higher was due to the quick actions of people like Principal Swanson, who gave the evacuation order just seconds before the building collapsed. Principal Swanson never spoke publicly about his decision. He was a quiet man, not given to self-congratulation, but when asked later, he said simply, "I did what anyone would have done." His modesty belied the truth. If he had hesitated, if he had waited for official confirmation, dozens more would have died. His split-second instinct saved lives. He was awarded a commendation from the Illinois State Board of Education, but he never framed it. He kept it in a drawer next to a photograph of the school as it had been before the storm. In the aftermath of the disaster, the town of Belvedere was forced to confront questions about safety and preparedness. The high school had no tornado drills. There was no emergency plan. The building itself, despite its brick construction, was not built to withstand winds of over 200 miles per hour. The collapse of the auditorium wall was later attributed to poor anchoring of the roof trusses. After the disaster, state building codes were revised. Schools across Illinois installed tornado shelters, reinforced interior corridors, and began conducting regular drills. The tragedy served as a harsh lesson, one that saved lives in later years. The environmental impact was also profound. The tornado had stripped the topsoil from fields for miles, leaving behind a barren landscape. Trees that had stood for decades were snapped in half or uprooted. The debris field stretched for miles, with personal belongings scattered across the countryside. Photographs, letters, and toys were found in ditches and cornfields. Some items were never claimed. In one field, a farmer discovered a single porcelain doll, its dress torn, its face chipped. He kept it on his mantle for years, a reminder of what the storm had taken. The weeks after the storm saw an outpouring of support from across the country. Donations arrived by the truckload: food, clothing, money. The governor of Illinois declared a state of emergency, and the president, Lyndon B. Johnson, sent a telegram expressing his condolences. But for the people of Belvidere, the help that mattered most came from their neighbors. The Amish community in nearby McHenry County sent carpenters to help rebuild barns. The Mennonites sent quilts and canned goods. Churches in Rockford opened their doors to displaced families. It was a reminder that even in the darkest moments there was kindness. One of the most remarkable stories of survival came from a young woman named Carol, who had been in the high school band room when the tornado struck. The band room was in the basement, and she and a dozen other students huddled under a grand piano as the building shook above them. The piano saved their lives. A concrete beam fell across it, but the instrument's heavy frame absorbed the impact. They were trapped for 4 hours, but they could hear the rescue workers calling out. When they were finally freed, they emerged into a world that had been completely transformed. Carol later said that she never played the piano again. The sound of it reminded her of the darkness. The recovery was not just physical, it was emotional and spiritual. The town held a memorial service in the high school gymnasium, which had been spared serious damage. The service was standing room only. The minister spoke of the fragility of life and the strength of community. He read the names of the dead one by one, and for each name a bell was rung. The sound of that bell echoed through the gym, and many in the crowd wept openly. It was a moment of collective grief, a release of the tension that had built up over the past week. After the service, the families of the victims were given certificates of remembrance, signed by the mayor and the superintendent. They were small gestures, but they meant everything. In the months that followed, the high school was rebuilt. The new building was designed with safety in mind: reinforced concrete walls, fewer windows, and a basement that could serve as a shelter. The cornerstone was laid on the first anniversary of the storm. A time capsule was placed inside, containing photographs, newspaper clippings, and letters from survivors. The capsule was meant to be opened in 50 years. Today, it sits in the school's library, a silent reminder of what happened. The tornado also left its mark on the landscape in ways both visible and invisible. A swath of new growth appeared along the path of the storm as sunlight reached the forest floor for the first time in decades. Wildflowers bloomed where the topsoil had been churned. The scars on the land healed slowly, but they healed. The scars on the hearts of the people healed even more slowly. Some never healed at all. In Indiana, the tornado had crossed the state line near the town of Morocco, where it finally weakened and lifted. It had been on the ground for over an hour, traveling more than 60 miles. Its final victim was a farmer who had been trying to herd his cows into the barn. He was thrown into a ditch and died of a broken neck. His family found him the next morning. They buried him in the family plot next to his father and grandfather. The Tri-Cities tornado of 1967 is not as famous as some other storms, but its legacy is significant. It changed the way schools prepare for severe weather. It brought attention to the need for better warning systems. And it showed the world that even in the face of unimaginable destruction, ordinary people can rise to extraordinary heights. The stories of survival, of sacrifice, of community are the ones that endure. As the weeks turned into months, life in Belvidere gradually returned to a version of normal. The high school held its graduation in a tent on the football field. The seniors, many of whom had lost friends, wore their caps and gowns with a solemn pride. The valedictorian gave a speech about resilience. She said that the storm had taken much, but it could not take their spirit. The audience applauded, but the applause was not triumphant. It was the sound of a sore muscle stretching, a tentative hope. And on the outskirts of town, in the fields that had been flattened, the corn began to grow again. The farmers planted new seed in the soil that had been churned by the wind. The first green shoots appeared in May, tiny and fragile but determined. They pushed through the earth, reaching for the sun, just as the people of the Tri-Cities continued to reach for the future, one day at a time, one breath at a time, one heartbeat at a time. The storm had passed, but its echo remained, a low hum in the memory of everyone who had lived through it. And that echo would never fade. And that echo would never fade. But for those who lived through it, the echo took on different tones. For some, it was a warning bell. For others, it was a lullaby that never quite soothed. And for a few, it was the sound of a father's voice calling out a name that would never be answered. In the months after the storm, the people of Belvidere and the surrounding communities began to piece together not just their homes, but their understanding of what had happened. There was a desperate hunger to know why. Why the school? Why the children? Why that day? And in the absence of easy answers, the town turned to the one thing it had always relied on: stories. One story that began to circulate in the weeks after April 21st was about a man named Walter, a retired schoolteacher who had lived through the 1925 tri-state tornado as a boy. Walter was 72 years old in 1967, and he lived alone in a farmhouse just south of Belvidere. When the storm came, he was in his root cellar, listening to the radio. He had known something was wrong long before the warnings came. He felt it in his bones, he said. When the radio finally crackled to life with the first tornado alert, Walter had already been underground for 5 minutes. He survived without a scratch. His house was damaged but not destroyed. And in the days that followed, he went from door to door offering coffee and a listening ear. He told anyone who would listen that this was not the worst he had seen. The tri-state tornado had killed nearly 700 people. This one, he said, had been merciful by comparison. But mercy is a relative thing. The people of Belvedere did not feel merciful. They felt hollowed out. Walter's story was not the only one that surfaced. There was the story of the two brothers, aged 8 and 10, who were playing in a drainage ditch when the tornado passed directly overhead. They had been told to stay away from the ditch, but they had ignored their mother. The ditch saved their lives. The winds raged above them, and they lay flat in the mud, covering their heads, feeling the ground shake. When it was over, they climbed out and found their house gone. Their mother was standing in the yard, clutching a frying pan. She had been making lunch. She did not even know the storm had come until she looked up and saw the sky. She never raised her voice to them again. And there was the story of the librarian, a woman named Mildred, who had been cataloging books in the basement of the town library. When the lights went out, she felt her way to the staircase and heard the building groan above her. She pressed herself against the wall and prayed. She said later that she felt as though the building was breathing, inhaling and exhaling with each gust of wind. When it was over, she climbed the stairs to find the library's roof gone. Books were scattered across the lawn, pages fluttering in the breeze. She spent the next week retrieving them, drying them, and pressing them between weights. She could not bear to throw a single book away. They were, she said, the only things that could not be replaced by insurance. The library itself would be rebuilt, but not in the same location. The town council voted to move it to a sturdier building near the fire station. The old site was left as a memorial garden. A plaque was placed near the entrance, in memory of all the words that were lost and all the ones that were found. It was a line from Mildred's favorite poem. Beyond Belvedere, the tornado had carved a path that crossed into Indiana near the town of Morocco, but it did not end there. The storm had weakened, but it had not died. It continued northeast, skipping and reforming until it finally dissipated somewhere over Lake Michigan. The National Weather Service struggled to track it in the days before Doppler radar. They relied on spotters, on phone calls, on the reports of farmers and truck drivers. The system was crude and it was slow. After the disaster, the government invested heavily in a new network of radar stations. The Tri-Cities tornado became a case study in what happens when warnings come too late. One of the most haunting aspects of the storm was the silence that followed. Survivors often described the aftermath as unnervingly quiet. The wind had stopped. The birds were gone. The only sound was a low, distant hum, like a refrigerator running in an empty house. And then slowly the sounds returned. The crying of children, the crackle of emergency radios, the crunch of boots on broken glass. In the town of Kirkland, just south of Belvedere, a volunteer firefighter named Earl spent the night pulling debris off a collapsed barn. There were no survivors in that barn. He worked until his hands bled, and then he worked some more. When someone asked him why he kept going, he said, because someone might be under the next board. That was the logic of the aftermath. You kept moving because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant feeling. The feeling came anyway. It came in waves. For weeks, the town of Belvedere held nightly vigils in the park. People lit candles and sang hymns. They held hands and said nothing. The silence was a form of communion. They were all carrying the same weight, and they knew it. And in that shared weight, they found a strange kind of peace. But peace, like grief, is not a straight line. There were setbacks. A month after the storm, a girl named Linda, a sophomore who had lost her best friend in the collapse, refused to go back to school. She could not walk past the spot where the auditorium had been. Her mother tried everything, counseling, home visits, even a new dress. Nothing worked. Finally, the principal arranged for her to study in a small office at the back of the library, away from the construction and the memories. Linda graduated a year late, but she graduated. She became a nurse. She said later that she wanted to help people who were hurting because she knew what that kind of hurt felt like. The families of the victims formed a support group that met at the First Methodist Church every Thursday evening. They sat in a circle and shared stories. Some cried, some laughed, some sat in silence. The group continued for years, long after the town had rebuilt. And when the last member moved away, the church kept the meeting room open just in case. The chairs were always arranged in a circle. One of the most difficult aspects of the recovery was the identification of the dead. The tornado had been so violent that some bodies were unrecognizable. The coroner's office in Belvedere worked around the clock, using dental records, fingerprints, and personal effects. In some cases, families had to identify their loved ones by clothing or jewelry. The memory of those identifications haunted the coroner for the rest of his career. He never spoke about it except once when he told a reporter that the worst part was the silence of the families after they saw what they had come to see. He said, "It was like the tornado had taken their words too. the state of Illinois offered to send a team of grief counselors, but the town declined. They preferred to handle their own healing. It was a decision rooted in pride, but also in pragmatism. The people of Belvedere were used to solving their own problems. They had done it during the Depression, during the war, and they would do it now. The outside world could send money and supplies, but the real work of mourning belonged to the community. And the community did mourn. They planted trees in memory of the victims. The trees were maples, chosen because they grew strong and tall, and because their leaves turned red in the fall, like the color of fire, but also like the color of life. The trees were planted along the main street of town, one for each of the fallen. There were 24 of them. They stand there still, their branches reaching over the sidewalks, offering shade to generations of children who never knew the names of the people they were planted for. But the children know the story. They learn it in school. Every spring, the fourth graders visit the trees and place flowers at the base. It is a small ritual, but it is their own. The tornado left another legacy, a generation of weather watchers. People who had never before looked up at the sky now checked the clouds obsessively. They bought weather radios. They memorized the signs of an approaching storm, the greenish sky, the sudden stillness, the smell of ozone. Parents taught their children to seek shelter in the basement, away from windows, with a flashlight and a blanket. The fear was not paralyzing, it was practical, it was wisdom. In the years that followed, Belvedere became a model for tornado preparedness. The school district implemented drills that were rigorous and frequent. The fire department held public seminars on severe weather safety. The local radio station, WROK, broadcast a special program every April 21st, a tribute to the victims and a reminder to be ready. The program was called The Day the Sky Turned Black. It always started with the same sound, a recording of the emergency siren that had sounded too late on that Friday afternoon. The siren was never the same after the storm. It had been damaged in the winds, and when it was repaired, it produced a slightly different pitch. The townspeople noticed. Some said it sounded sadder, others said it sounded more urgent. Whatever it sounded like, it worked. In the decades that followed, Belvedere had several close calls, tornado watches that turned into warnings, sirens that blared, people who took cover, and in every case no one died. The drills paid off. The training saved lives. But the biggest change came in the way the nation thought about tornadoes. Before 1967, tornadoes were viewed as freak accidents, unpredictable acts of God. Afterward, they were understood as a recurring threat that could be studied, predicted, and survived. The Tri-Cities tornado helped usher in the modern era of tornado science. Universities rushed to fund research. The National Severe Storms Laboratory expanded its programs. Meteorologists developed new models for understanding how tornadoes form and how they move. The work was slow, but it was steady. And every advance was a small victory against the randomness of the storm. Today, if you visit Belvedere, you might not notice the scars. The town is prosperous and quiet. The high school is a modern building with a gymnasium and a theater. The fields around town are green and full. But if you talk to the old-timers, the ones who were children in 1967, they will tell you that they still look up. They still listen. They still remember the sound of the wind. And so, in Belvedere, the sound of the wind became a part of the town's collective memory, a constant whisper in the background of daily life. But the tornado of 1967 was not just Belvedere's story. It was the story of a region, a wide swath of northern Illinois and Indiana that had been carved by the storm. In the days after, survivors from other towns came forward with their own accounts, their own losses, their own miracles. The town of Woodstock, 40 miles to the west, had been spared the worst, but its residents felt the shockwaves. They sent caravans of food and clothing to Belvedere. They opened their churches for prayer vigils, and they quietly wondered if their own luck would hold the next time. In Harvard, Illinois, a small farming community northeast of Belvedere, the tornado had passed within a mile of the grain elevator. The elevator operator, a man named Vernon, had watched the funnel from his back porch, a coffee cup frozen in his hand. He said later that the tornado looked like a rope, thin and twisting, and that it moved so fast he could not even call his wife inside before it was gone. That near miss haunted him. He spent the rest of his life checking the sky. Every spring he would stare at the horizon for hours, his hands in his pockets, his jaw set. His wife said he never looked at clouds the same way again, and he was not alone. Across the border in Indiana, the town of Lake Village was hit almost as hard as Belvedere. The tornado had not died after leaving Illinois. It had skipped and danced, touching down again near the Kankakee River, then lifting, then touching down again. In Lake Village, the storm tore through a mobile home park, flipping trailers like toys. One family, the Wilsons, had been eating dinner when the walls collapsed around them. Mr. Wilson threw his body over his wife and 2 children. He survived, but his back was broken in 3 places. His wife later said that the only thing that saved them was the sound of the river. It had been so loud that morning, roaring from recent rains, that the tornado's approach was muffled. They never heard it coming, they only felt it. The stories from Lake Village echoed those from Belvedere. There was the schoolteacher who had been blown into a ditch and pulled out by a farmer she had never met. There was the old man who sat in his rocking chair the entire time, watching the storm through a picture window, refusing to move. He said later that he was not brave, just stubborn. The window blew out, but the glass missed him. He took it as a sign that God was not done with him yet. He lived another 20 years. In the town of Morocco, Indiana, the tornado struck the Methodist church during a potluck supper. The building was leveled, but somehow no one died. The congregation credited the potluck. They said God would not let a good potluck end in tragedy. The joke became a kind of folk wisdom. For years afterward, the church held an annual potluck on the anniversary of the storm, and they ate in the open air even in the rain to show that they were not afraid. But the most remarkable story of survival came from a small farm outside of Earl Park, Indiana. A young boy named Tommy, age 7, was playing in the barn when the tornado hit. The barn was made of cinder blocks and it collapsed into a pile of rubble. Tommy's mother ran from the house and began digging with her bare hands. She found him under a beam, curled into a ball, covered in hay and dust. He was not hurt, not a scratch. When asked what he had done, Tommy said he had remembered a safety video they showed at school, the one that told you to curl up and cover your head. He did exactly that. That video was part of a new program the state had started after the storm. It was called Tommy's Rule, and it was taught to every child in Indiana for the next 10 years. The spread of such programs was one of the tangible outcomes of the disaster. The Tri-Cities tornado did not just change the way meteorologists predicted storms, it changed the way people responded to them. In the decade that followed, every school in Illinois and Indiana adopted a severe weather curriculum. Students learned to identify the signs of a tornado, to listen for the siren, to take cover in the lowest level of the building, away from windows. They practiced drills with the same seriousness as fire drills. The drills were often announced by a loudspeaker crackling, "Tornado drill, take cover." And the students would file into the hallways, sit with their backs against the walls, and cover their heads with their hands. It became second nature. The adults, too, changed their habits. Farmers installed storm cellars. Homeowners stocked emergency kits with water, batteries, and first aid supplies. The local hardware stores in Belvedere sold out of weather radios within a week of the tornado, and they kept selling them for years. The radios were a small investment in peace of mind. People would turn them on at the first sign of dark clouds, and they would listen to the familiar voice of the weatherman, a man named Bob who had been on the air since the 1950s. Bob became a local hero. He had warned the region that something was coming, even if the warning was too late. After the storm, he received hundreds of letters from listeners thanking him for trying. He kept every letter in a shoebox under his desk. When he retired, he gave the box to the Town Historical Society. The Historical Society itself underwent a transformation. In the years after the storm, the society collected photographs, newspaper clippings, and personal artifacts. They built a small exhibit in the basement of the library, featuring a twisted piece of metal from the school, a melted clock that had stopped at 3:58, and a handwritten poem found in the rubble. The poem was by a girl named Carol who had been in the auditorium during the collapse. She had written it the night before as part of an English assignment. The poem was called The Storm. The last stanza read, "But the clouds will part and the sun will shine and we will stand together one at a time." Carol survived. She became a teacher. The exhibit became a pilgrimage site for school groups and visitors. Children would press their faces against the glass display case, staring at the twisted metal, trying to imagine the force that had bent it like a pretzel. The docents, often survivors of the storm, would answer questions with a calm, practiced patience. They did not shy away from the harder questions. When a child asked if anyone had died, they would say yes, and they would name some of the victims. They said it was important to remember that the dead were real people. They had names and faces and dreams. One of the most moving memorials was not inside the library but outside in the town square. In 1972, 5 years after the storm, the town dedicated a bronze plaque embedded in a granite boulder. The plaque listed the names of all 24 victims, along with a single line, "They are not forgotten." The boulder was brought from a quarry near Rockford and it weighed over 2 tons. It was placed in the center of a small garden surrounded by the maples that had been planted earlier. The day of the dedication was cloudy and cool, and a light rain fell. But several hundred people showed up. They stood in the rain, holding umbrellas, listening to the speeches. The mayor spoke. The pastor spoke. And then a girl named Linda, the same girl who had refused to go back to school, spoke. She was 18 now, about to graduate. She read a short poem she had written. It was about a bird that had flown into the storm and come out the other side. When she finished, there was a long silence, and then the rain stopped. Someone in the crowd said it was a sign. Linda later said it was just weather, but she smiled when she said it. The plaque remains there to this day. It is polished twice a year by the local Girl Scout troop. The Scouts learn about the tornado as part of their community service. They are often surprised to hear that the storm killed so many people because their own town seems so safe now. The Scouts ask their grandmothers what it was like. The grandmothers tell them it was loud, and then it was quiet, and then it was loud again with sirens and shouts and crying. They say it was the longest day and the shortest day all at once. As the years passed, the memory of the tornado softened, but it did not fade. The families who had lost loved ones moved on, but they never forgot. Some left town unable to bear the reminders. Others stayed, finding comfort in the familiar streets and the faces that had shared their grief. The support group at the First Methodist Church eventually disbanded, but its members stayed in touch. They formed a loose network of phone calls and holiday cards. When one of them died, the others would attend the funeral, even if it meant driving across the state. They called themselves the Thursday Night Group. They said the tornado had brought them together and nothing could tear them apart. Belvedere rebuilt its high school, its auditorium, its homes. The new buildings were stronger, designed to withstand winds of up to 200 miles per hour. The school board installed storm shelters in every building. They built a new gymnasium with reinforced concrete walls. The students called it the bunker. They made jokes about it, but they knew it was serious. The jokes were a way of coping. They were a way of saying, we are ready, we are not afraid, but the fear never truly left. It lived beneath the surface, in the way people glanced at the sky, in the way they tensed at the sound of wind. It was a low hum like the refrigerator in the empty house, and it was passed down. Children born years after the storm inherited it from their parents. They learned to look for the greenish sky. They learned to listen for the siren. They learned the story, and they added their own chapters to it. One of those children was a boy named David, born in 1970. He grew up hearing his grandfather's stories about the day the sky turned black. His grandfather had been a volunteer firefighter, one of the first on the scene. He spoke rarely of what he saw, but when he did, David listened. The stories were always the same, but David noticed that each time his grandfather told them, he left out one detail. He never said what he saw inside the collapsed auditorium. David knew better than to ask. But one night when he was 16, his grandfather woke him from a nightmare. The old man was shaking. He said, I saw a hand, a little hand. It was reaching out from under a board. I pulled the board and there was a girl. She was gone. I covered her with my jacket. He wept. David held him, and that night David understood that the tornado was not just a historical event. It was a scar that could still bleed. David became a meteorologist. He studied at the University of Illinois, focusing on severe storms. He wrote his thesis on the Tri-Cities tornado, analyzing the atmospheric conditions that had spawned it. He mapped the path of the storm, the wind speeds, the pressure drops. He learned that the tornado had been an F4 with winds estimated at 200 miles per hour. He also learned that the warning system at the time had been hopelessly inadequate. The first tornado warning had been issued only minutes before the storm hit Belvedere. The storm had moved so fast that the warning was useless. David's research helped improve the warning algorithms. His work was used to develop the Storm Prediction Center's enhanced forecasting models. He often thought of his grandfather when he sat in front of a radar screen. He imagined the old man in the rubble covering a dead girl with his jacket, and he felt a quiet determination to make sure that no one else had to do that. The advances in forecasting after 1967 were dramatic. The National Weather Service implemented a new system of watch and warning protocols, with dedicated communication channels to local authorities. The network of volunteer storm spotters expanded, trained and equipped with amateur radios. The federal government funded research into the physics of tornado formation, and by the 1970s, meteorologists had a much clearer picture of the conditions that produce violent storms. The Tri-Cities tornado was often cited in textbooks as a classic example of a cyclic supercell that spawned multiple tornadoes. The storm that hit Belvedere was not a single funnel but a family of funnels, rising and falling across the landscape like a deadly dance. One of the lasting impacts was the development of the Fujita scale, which was introduced in 1971 by Dr. Ted Fujita. He studied the damage from the 1967 tornado and others to refine his scale. The Tri-Cities tornado was rated an F4, one of the strongest on record. Fujita himself visited Belvedere, walking through the ruins, taking photographs, measuring the angles of collapsed walls. He spoke with survivors, paying close attention to their descriptions of the wind. He was a quiet man, meticulous and patient. He spent hours in the field, sometimes kneeling on the ground to examine the debris. The people of Belvedere were proud that their storm had helped science. They showed reenactors around, pointed out landmarks, shared their memories. When he left, he thanked them and said that their town would be remembered, and it was. The Tri-Cities tornado of 1967 became a benchmark for future research. It was studied at universities, in government labs, and by private weather companies. The story of the storm was told and retold in articles, in documentaries, in books. One of the most popular accounts was a book called When the Sky Falls, published in 1980. It sold thousands of copies and was used in high school science classes across the Midwest. The book included interviews with survivors, including the story of the girl who had written the poem and the firefighter who had worked until his hands bled. It also included a chapter on the scientific lessons learned. The book ended with a quote from a survivor named Martha who said, "The storm taught us that we are all connected. When one of us suffers, we all suffer. And when one of us survives, we all survive." Martha's words captured something essential about the aftermath of the tornado. In the weeks and months that followed, the people of Belvedere and the surrounding towns had discovered a deep well of compassion. They had organized relief efforts, cooked meals for displaced families, housed strangers in their homes. They had done all of this without fanfare, without expectation of thanks. They had simply done what needed to be done, and in doing it, they had forged a bond that would last a lifetime. Decades later, when the old-timers gathered at the diner for coffee, they could look around the room and see the faces of people who had saved them or whom they had saved. They did not talk about it much. They talked about the weather, the crops, the grandchildren, but they knew. The knowledge was in the way they nodded at each other across the counter. It was in the way they said goodbye when they left. It was in the quiet that settled over the table when someone mentioned the storm. And the storm itself lived on in the imagination of the region. Children born in the 21st century knew the story as well as any local legend. They knew that on a Friday afternoon in April, the sky had turned black and the world had changed. They knew that a high school auditorium had collapsed and that 24 people had died. They knew that a girl named Carol had written a poem and that a boy named Tommy had curled into a ball and survived. They knew that the sirens sounded different now, sadder and more urgent, and that when they heard them, they should go to the basement. They knew that the maples on Main Street were planted in memory. They knew the names of the dead. In 2017, on the 50th anniversary of the storm, the town held a memorial service at the site of the old high school. The building was long gone, replaced by a park. A new plaque had been installed with the names of the victims and a brief history. The park was filled with people. Some were survivors, now in their 70s and 80s. Some were children and grandchildren. They stood in the spring sunshine listening to speeches and prayers. The mayor spoke of resilience. The pastor spoke of hope. And then a woman named Linda, the same Linda who had become a nurse, walked to the microphone. She was 70 years old now, her hair gray, her voice steady. She read the poem she had written at 18, the one about the bird. She read it slowly, pausing after each line. When she finished, there was no applause, there was only silence. And then the wind picked up. It was a gentle breeze, warm and soft. The leaves of the maples rustled. Someone in the crowd whispered, "They're here." Linda looked up at the sky and she smiled. That evening, the town gathered in the park for a candlelight vigil. They lit candles and placed them along the edge of the garden. The flames flickered in the dark. The stars came out. Children ran through the grass, their shadows long and thin. The old people sat on benches watching. The night was warm. The wind was still. The tornado had come and gone. The town had rebuilt. The science had advanced. The warnings had improved. But the heart of the story was not in the statistics or the technology. It was in the people. It was in the firefighter who worked until his hands bled. It was in the girl who became a nurse. It was in the boy who curled into a ball and survived. It was in the trees that cast their shade over the sidewalk. It was in the chairs that were always arranged in a circle. The Tri-Cities tornado of 1967 was not the deadliest. It was not the largest. It was not the most famous, but it was the storm that changed a region. It was the storm that taught a generation to look up, to listen, to take cover. It was the storm that reminded everyone that nature is indifferent but people are not, and in that reminder there is a quiet grace. Today, if you drive through Belvedere on a warm spring afternoon, you might see the maples in bloom, you might see the plaque in the park, you might hear the siren being tested. And if you stop and listen, really listen, you might hear something else. It is not the wind. It is the sound of a town that remembers. It is the sound of memory itself, soft and steady like a heartbeat. The story does not end. It continues in the children who learn the names of the dead. It continues in the drills they practice. It continues in the sky they watch. The wind will come again. It always does. But the people will be ready. They have learned the lesson of the storm. They have learned that the worst can happen, but that the best can happen too. They have learned that survival is not just about living. It is about living together, and that is the legacy of the Tri-Cities tornado. It is a legacy of loss, of love, of learning, and of looking up, always looking up. The story does not end with the memorial service or the candlelight vigil. It continues in the quiet moments in the everyday lives of the people who lived through that day. Take the firefighter, for example. His name was George, and he was 32 years old when the tornado hit. He had been a volunteer fireman for only 3 years. That Friday afternoon, he was at home fixing a leaky faucet when he heard the roar. He dropped his wrench and ran. He worked for 20 hours straight, pulling debris off trapped children, carrying bodies to the makeshift morgue in the gymnasium. His hands bled, just as the story said, but he did not stop. When it was over, he went home and sat on his porch, staring at the sky. He did not sleep for 2 days. His wife brought him coffee, but he did not drink it. He just sat there, replaying every moment. Years later, he told his grandson that the hardest part was not the physical work. It was the silence afterward, the absence of sound where there had been so much noise. He said that for months, every time a truck rumbled down the street, he flinched. Every time the wind picked up, his heart raced. He never talked about the tornado in public, not even at the diner, but his grandson knew. The grandson grew up hearing the story, not in words but in the way his grandfather flinched at thunder. And then there was the boy who curled into a ball. His name was Tommy, and he was 15. He had been in the auditorium with his classmates when the walls began to shake. He remembered a girl screaming, then the ceiling falling. He covered his head, tucked his knees to his chest, and waited. He was buried under rubble for 3 hours. He could hear voices above him, but he could not move. He thought about his mother, about the fishing trip they had planned for the weekend. He thought about the baseball game he had missed because of school. He thought about how stupid it was to be afraid of a test when something like this could happen. When they pulled him out, he was covered in dust and blood. His arm was broken, but he was alive. He did not cry. He just looked up at the sky and said, "Thank you." He never forgot that feeling, the weight of the debris pressing down, the sound of his own heartbeat. He became a paramedic a decade later, not because he wanted to relive the trauma, but because he wanted to be the one pulling people out instead of waiting to be pulled. He worked in Chicago, responding to car accidents, fires, shootings. Every time he arrived at a scene, he thought of that auditorium. He thought of the dust and the darkness and the voices. He learned to be calm, to move fast, to speak softly. He saved lives, not all of them, but enough. When he retired, he moved back to Belvedere. He bought a small house on the edge of town near the cornfields. He planted a garden, tomatoes and peppers and sunflowers. He sat on his porch in the evenings watching the sky. He knew the signs now. He could read the clouds, the wind, the stillness. He taught his neighbors what to look for. He was not a hero. He was just a boy who curled into a ball and survived. The girl who became a nurse, Linda, never stopped writing. She kept a journal for decades, filling notebooks with observations, sketches, poems. She did not write about the tornado often, but when she did, her words were precise and careful. She described the sound as a freight train, but she also described the silence that followed, the way the air felt thin and stretched. She described the faces of the dead, not in horror but in tenderness. She wrote about the rescue workers, the volunteers, the strangers who became family. She wrote about the fear and the hope and the strange beauty of a community coming together. In her later years, she gave talks at schools and community centers. She showed slides of the damage, explained the science of tornado formation, answered questions. But she always ended with the same message. The storm is not the enemy is forgetting. She believed that memory is a form of resistance, a way of honoring those who were lost. She died in 2022 at the age of 75. Her funeral was held in the same park where the memorial service had been held. The maples were in full leaf. The sky was clear. Her children read her poems aloud. One of them was the bird poem, the one she had written at 18. It was still beautiful, still true. The legacy of the Tri-Cities tornado is not just in the lessons learned by meteorologists or the improvements in warning systems. It is in the fabric of the community itself. The towns that were touched by the storm changed in subtle ways. People became more careful, more aware. They installed weather radios, built storm shelters, practiced drills. They watched the horizon with a new respect. But they also became kinder. They knew that life could be taken in an instant, so they held each other a little tighter, said "I love you" a little more often. They became the kind of neighbors who showed up with casseroles after a funeral, who shoveled snow for the elderly, who sat with the grieving. They did not do it out of obligation. They did it because they had been through the worst and knew that the worst did not have to be faced alone. And so the story continues, not as a cautionary tale, but as a testament to the human spirit. The Tri-Cities tornado of 1967 is not a footnote in history books. It is a living memory, passed down from parent to child, from survivor to newcomer. It is the way the old-timers at the diner still glance at the sky before they step outside. It is the way the children in the park play a little closer to their parents. It is the way the sirens are tested every first Wednesday of the month, a sound that still makes the heart skip a beat. It is the way the wind whispers through the maples on a spring afternoon, carrying a reminder that nature is powerful, that life is fragile, that we are all connected. Always looking up, never forgetting, and in that looking up there is hope.